Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, part 4 of ethics, and tonight I want to do the ethics of tiny homes and another example, but mostly tiny homes. Before I do, though, I would like to again announce that I have now, I think, one, maybe two spots left for the class in France. So a couple of people have signed up, so there's one, maybe two spots left. It's the third weekend in May. So if you're in France and you want to take a class with me for some perverse reason, you can get my email on my website and just let me know and I can send you the details. And if it works for you, it would be lovely to see you in France. So a lot of people in Europe had asked for me to do a class in somewhere in Europe. And so I am going to be doing it this May. Anyway, so thank you for everybody who has signed up. And if you're interested, just let me know and I'll send you a message. All right. So the ethics of tiny homes. Now, here's where you really, it helps me think, but hopefully it'll help you think as well. See the difference between a moral judgment and an ethical judgment. So in the United States, we have this, housing very expensive, but also very expensive all over the world. In fact, the United States, for expensive as it is not the most expensive place to buy real estate in the world, but plenty damn expensive nonetheless. And what people have noticed is that the average size of the house has grown over the years. So I think the median size house in the United States today is, these are numbers that are hard to derive. So, but I think fairly confident you can put that around 1,600 square feet. And the average size of new construction is like 2,400 or 2,500 square feet. So we have these large and increasingly large houses. So the newer housing stock is getting bigger and bigger. Simultaneously, the number of people per house is declining. So that currently it's about 2.4 or 2.5 people per house. So you have these very large houses with relatively few people living in them. And I think it's half of all suburban U.S. homes have a single person living in them. So you're talking about homes that are, right around 1,600 square feet with a sole occupant. We also have a lot of empty homes in the United States as well. So people looked at this and they said, well, this is perverse, right? You're using all these resources, all these spaces, very expensive. And so what we should do is build tiny homes. Now, I don't have anything against tiny homes whatsoever. I think it's a fascinating idea, and we'll talk about it. There's lots of interesting insights and experiments going on with tiny homes. But what's curious about this is it so clearly articulates two core ethos of the American system. One is individualism, and the other is materialism. So first, let's look at individualism. Now, you could take the exact same problem and go, wow, look, we have a lot of large houses that have very few people in them. And you could go, you know what? We should put more people in those houses. We should have a communal living movement. That would be the least American thing of all time. Now, it turns out that there is, in fact, sort of a sketchy side communal living movement going on, because when houses get so ridiculously expensive, people are forced to live together, to pay the rent or pay the mortgage or whatever. But what we've focused on culturally, what's got the news, what's got the press, and is on Instagram and newspaper stories and magazine stories and all that, is this notion of, the tiny house movement. But notice this is the same problem with a completely different ethical response. And you can then say, well, which is better, right? Should we emphasize, not that we have to choose, of course, these are not mutually exclusive in a complex, large society, but it just articulates so clearly that what we've chosen to focus on as a solution is that thing that helps feed into our predetermined societal belief that the best thing you can do is whatever is best for you. And so take whatever resources or problem or difficulty or challenge you face and solve it by going into yourself or getting more for yourself or protecting yourself, or it's you. And again, but what's interesting here, and what's perfectly clear, by the way, is probably from a psychological and health standpoint, it would be vastly better for people because, loneliness is this huge, very damaging to people's psychology and health. And again, going through the pandemic and having all these people isolated, one of the things that public health officials kept saying is, look, there's a serious psychological trauma going on all over the world as people are being locked down, often by themselves, or being isolated. This is terrible for people. right. I mean, particularly when it's not voluntary, but it's terrible for people in any case. And when your ethos as a society, as in the United States, is towards individualism, and you keep facing problems and you go, oh, big houses, not very many people in them, let's make smaller houses with not very many people in them. As opposed to, as I mentioned before, you could just flip that around and go, well, let's just move more people in together. And then you'll be in a community. And again, the evidence here is pretty damn convincing that you'll probably be psychologically better and physically healthier if you live in a healthy community. Of course, you don't want to live in an unhealthy community. That's not good for you either, right? So, but that notion of saying, oh, let's spend a lot of time and information and research and experimentation trying to come up with healthy communal living systems so that we can reimagine our existing housing stock, lots of large multi-bedroom homes with garages and whatnot in the suburbs, but put a bunch more people in there. Can we make this work? How do we figure this out? What's the system? What makes a good mix of housing? How do you deal with all the legal stuff, right? Like this, why isn't there this big national experiment or a whole series of experiments going on that says, oh, let's do that? Instead, that all that energy and creativity, and again, that's also happening in part, by the way, again, these aren't mutually exclusive, but much more energy and interest and focus is going into that. No, let's do the tiny house movement and let's try and solve the legal and infrastructure issues and all this about new tiny homes. Because now it's myself, right? So what's happening is we're actually going to be reducing the average person per house even further. I mean, we're making them smaller, so there you go, but we're also reducing the number of people per house when you make them small, particularly when they get really small, like 400, 500, 600 square feet. Then you're like, okay, now we're down to one, maybe two people, but you aren't going to probably put 5 people in there. So, wow, like why is that the choice? Well, that's the choice because our American ethos emphasizes individualism. And so it's again, not good or bad. It's just hey, this is what happens when you have these undercurrents of social values that inform the kinds of decisions and outlooks and the kinds of solutions you'll explore for a problem. If they're not articulated, if you haven't reflected on them, if you haven't chose them, what you'll do is just reproduce those that are written into your society. Every society has to have these, and without thinking, and then you won't notice that you've just made this huge ethical leap, even though you in fact have made this huge ethical leap. And so that's this individual focus. And then if you look at the videos on Instagram, and I think architecturally very interesting, all this, you see it generally as the expression of a person, sometimes a couple, but often just a single person saying, this is why I did this, and this is how it goes, and so on and so forth. And it's all about a person being independent on their own. I'm liberated. I don't have to pay a bunch of money, even though they're often quite expensive. They're not as expensive as a huge house. So that's the individual aspect of it. The other side is the material aspect. Presented with a problem, we want to buy something because we know that if we buy something, we will solve every possible problem, right? Every problem is solved through the purchase of something. That's just the answer in America, right? This is how we deal with issues. If you have a problem, then you shop around and find some kind of solution for that problem that is purchasable. If you go, we need a communal housing movement, you're repurposing and reimagining the materials that already exist. You aren't making it new. You might be, again, restructuring, do all kinds of things, creative things, redesign issues, all that's just amazing. But you aren't going out and going, oh, I just need to buy something of my own that is new. Instead, I need to make something or buy something that is in fact custom built for me, or that it's a new thing, or that this, like, we just can't say, hey, we have plenty of housing stock. We have plenty of square footage of housing in the country, which we do. There's no shortage of square footage of housing. It's just divided up very strangely. We have lots of empty houses. We have lots of houses with almost nobody in them. And we have a few houses with a lot of people in them. And when you get to cities, you do get some denser living arrangements in America's major cities, like most major cities. But no, that's no good, right? There's not only is there not something to sell, you're almost unselling. If lots of people started to do this, what you would do is you would theoretically, if this was super popular, you would actually dramatically reduce the cost of housing because you would dramatically reduce the demand for housing. So for instance, if we went from like say an average of 2.5 people per house to an average of 3.5 people per house, in theory you've just pulled like 15 or 20% of the demand out of the housing market, which would be sort of phenomenal, right? Maybe catastrophic. Maybe we don't want to pull that much out, but you see the issue here is it actually creates a surplus in an environment where everybody's like, oh, we have to build small houses because we lack housing. No, that's the perception that we lack housing is like, oh, I want a big house to my own, and I can't have that. So the answer is to have a small house to my own. As opposed to the answer is to find some people I like and let's all live communally in a big house and fill it with people, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 7, maybe 4, whatever works for you. And then it's probably super affordable, or at least much more affordable than it would be otherwise. So if you took a 4-bedroom house and you put 6 people in it, even if that house is pretty expensive in some suburbs, you still between 6 people, probably, that would be the equivalent of, let's say a tiny house costs $60,000 and you had 6 people. Now you're in a $360,000, $400,000 home that exists, right? That's the same amount of money in some ways. If you figure out what the rent is or what the mortgage payment is, coming up with agreements, maybe where you can share equity if the house increases in value, all these kinds of things. That would, dramatically alter the real estate landscape. And again, it would have the effect of creating a surplus where currently we see that, we have a really insufficient housing stock and, et cetera. But again, that would destroy our whole notion that what we want to do is something for ourselves and we need to buy it. It needs to be ours and or best case scenario, it needs to be new. We need to make it, build it custom, make it new. And again, I'm not opposed to this. I'm not saying like, hey, don't build tiny houses, don't do interesting architectural experiments. It's just this is the very much stronger response to a problem that could be solved in multiple other ways, most notably just the communal way. It exemplifies like our unwillingness or our ethical or our values that say, look, no, that's not how you do it. You don't negotiate with people. You don't live in groups. You certainly don't live in groups with people who aren't your immediate family. That's wrong, right? That's just not how people do it. You want to be on your own. You want to be independent. You want to have your own house. And if that means making it small, then you need a new small house. You even see this when they do, it just cracks me up because I'm not opposed to it. It just cracks me up. The ultimate expression of this is when they do communities of tiny houses, which is fine. Again, I'm totally fine with it. But if you actually look at the materials, if you stuck all those together and made a big house out of it, it would actually take a lot less material because, of course, there's a lot of extra walls and surface area and stuff that you wouldn't necessarily need if it were all organized as one house. But they'll take 10 or 15 or 20 tiny houses and make a community in a little village or something, a micro village, I guess. And they go, wow, look, tiny houses providing houses for the people, which is true. Again, it is doing that in some ways, but you could probably do the same thing with 3 suburban homes. But yeah. So, and again, I think it's great for people to be able to choose, by the way. I'm not saying one of these should be enforced, but if you are not thinking about the kinds of values that your society is promoting and sort of training you in, then you are forced. You aren't actually making decisions. You aren't actually stopping and going, what are my values? Do I value my friends? Do I want to spend more or less time with my friends? Well, if I want to spend more time with my friends, and I like my friends, maybe we could work something out where we live together. Then we could actually spend a fair amount of time together, right? I go, oh, hey, look, the math on this kind of works out. It's it's not really that confusing in a way. It's like, oh, if I could bear it, maybe I can't bear them. Maybe I'm like, oh no, I just want to live on my own. And we default to living on our own if we can. Statistically, of course, there's a variation again in such a large population, but statistically for Americans, we will default to living on our own if that option is available, and we tend to see density of living increase relative to cost of living. So if you live in an area that has a high cost of living relative to wages, then density goes up. If you don't, density tends to go down, which is not universally true, but that tends to be the pattern because that's our default value. Now, this is not true all over the world. This is not a given universal value. In many places, the more money you make, the more people you live with, because that gives you the opportunity to support more people. You want more people around, bigger family, bring the grandparents in to live with you, nieces and nephews come to live with you, right? So like, hey, that's the sign of success. How do you know someone's successful? Well, they live with 20 members of their family. That's how you do it. Or sometimes groups of people just form, they'll form a little community, live in a house, or maybe two houses are close together, and like, hey, this is great. This is how we want to be. And if you talk to people, often they'll recount to you, particularly as people get older, you go, oh, the best time of my life was blah. And often, not invariably, of course, but often you'll hear some communal. They don't necessarily articulate it this way. They're like, oh, I was my friends and we were in college and we all rented this crazy house. It was all run down and, we were going to classes and we had big fun. And it was just great to live with those people. And I moved out and got a job and now I live in an expensive and theoretically nice townhouse in, I don't know, Boston, right? Okay, there you go. But I really remember living with friends and having a great time. And I was like, well, is it that you've decided that now you're much happier, that you get to live on your own? And now that you have more resources, this is the crazy thing, right? As people get more resources, it tends to allow them to express the values that they think they have. And then they stand there and go, wow, I wish I were living with my friends again. And I'm like, okay, you make 10 times, 20 times more money than you used to in college if you made anything. Do you have friends? You get to choose where you live. How complicated is this? But if you think of your own life, maybe it's not true for you, but I think for many people, they will reflect and go, I really enjoyed the time when, I was living with my brothers and we were all hanging out together and that was great. And, now we're all spread out, but, maybe I could get an environment like that again with some people I could hang out with. And that would be wonderful and interesting and certainly kind of change the dynamics of how I'm living. Are these sorts of experiences in your mind? Is this sort of the things that you've had happen in your life? If so, then you ask yourself, how did I end up living? If you do live in an environment that doesn't reflect that, sort of this distance or this sort of tension between how you remember really loving it and how you live currently. And those are the sorts of things that you want to examine. Again, not that you're living wrong or right. It's just that, are you living with the values that you cherish? And are those values yours, or are they ones that you just defaulted into? Oh, I made a bunch of money. I'm working. I'm successful. I should buy a house, or I should buy a townhouse someplace. I'm not living with anybody. I'm not married. I don't have kids. So I guess I'll just live alone. Right? That's the obvious, simple. In fact, many places, actually, this is slight legal barriers to this. There's like, you're not allowed to rent rooms in many places. Like, oh, you can't rent a room out. So if you have a stranger living with you, eventually people are like, well, who's that person? If you said, oh, that person is my boyfriend, then you're fine, right? Like, oh, okay, boyfriends are fine, but you can't rent it. But if you just said, oh, it's my buddy Ed, they're like, well, how long is Ed going to, is he a member? Does he get to use the gym or what? So there's a lot of rules that people get suspicious about this. They're like, yeah, you can have people, but you can't have too many people. Too many people is bad. We begin to suspect you're a foreigner of some kind. And two, you can't have people who aren't related to you in a way that's sort of culturally acceptable. And like saying, yeah, me and a bunch of friends just live together. It's like, oh, we're very suspicious of this. So those two American values of individualism and materialism sort of get expressed, very strongly in a movement like the tiny house movement, because it allows you to act very, clearly. And many people, and I think it is good for some people. Some people do like living alone, by the way. I think that's also part of the lie of it. They're like, oh, this is a great solution for everybody. I think in some ways it's a good solution for those people who really are pretty much like to be in small spaces on their own, right? Like that's probably, for them, it's probably a great solution. But as a model for everyone, I'm suspicious. The general average of human experience suggests quite strongly we're much happier, much healthier when we're not lonely and we live communally. Now, the ultimate version of this, and this I will say is wrong, by the way. The tiny house movement, I think, is just an example of ethics, in general, and, there's no wrong answer, and it's something to be explored. In this case, no, this is just wrong. I guess I'm not supposed to say that as a core principle of my lecture, but I will go out on a limb on this one. And I keep seeing these advertised where there are these single meal shakes, and like you have some powdery thing. Sometimes it's all protein, sometimes it's all vegetables, sometimes it's all mushrooms, sometimes it's God only knows what, a bunch of chemicals, and you just add water and you shake it up and you drink it, and that's your meal. And it's only like, $2 a meal or $2.75 a meal, and it's ready in minutes, and you don't have any cleanup, and you just boom, hammer your meal, and you're off. I think this is a force of evil in the universe, if I can define it that way. And what's wrong here, but again, is sort of the crazy extension of the tiny house thing. And I'm like, why would anybody think this is a good idea? And I was like, right. So I'm super busy and I just don't feel like I have time to eat. And so it's vastly more convenient for me if I just get basic nutrition and hammer it down as quickly as possible and move on with my life. Now, what you've just articulated is that your life has come to a very, very bad place. And you should probably stop and carefully rethink this because, again, all of the research, and there's a lot of research on this, suggests that eating slowly and eating with company, again, friends, coworkers, people you enjoy, is the key to sort of a healthy diet. There is no healthy diet that you slam down after you've shaken it in a plastic container. That does not provide human health. It's impossible. And so what happens is, rather than saying, wow, why am I so busy? Or going, I'm really busy and my schedule doesn't permit it. So I'm just going to, which is, by the way, meals are crazy all over the world. Like what constitutes a meal, when you eat, how long you take, it's all over the map. And you might say, I don't really have a lot of time, but I'm going to eat a small breakfast and then I'm going to have a sort of big dinner with my friends, right? Like that's what I'm going to shoot for. And I'll have a snack or something later, or lunch. We're all about lunch, right? I'm a big lunch person, by the way. I think lunch is maybe the most beautiful word in the English language is probably lunch. But, you have your friends, you sit down, you have lunch, it's in your work day, whatever, so you get this big break and you just kind of relax and take some time. And, lunch is great. But the notion that you're improving your life somehow by quickly ingesting nutrients is again, the value here. One, it articulates the value that my body is somehow divorced from my psychology. So like how I eat, how much time I spend eating, and what I eat, textures, colors, feel, flavor, taste, smell, laughter, conversation, doesn't affect me, right? My body is a machine. My body does not care about these things. I'm a machine. I will consume them. Now, your body is not a machine, and it's not like just putting gas in a car, but this is clearly the analogy that we've derived. My body is a machine. If I put good gas in it, and of course, nobody knows what good gas is because some of them, again, are like, they're basically, chocolate milk, and some of them are all the way over to, sort of totally organic ground kale greens and all this, and stuff from the ocean and seaweed is also like super healthy, whatever. No, it's not super healthy. It's super bad for you. But it's not super bad for you because the nutrients and the content, although the chocolate shake ones, one becomes suspicious, but because of the context in which your value system has constructed a model of who you are. That my psychology around eating, my psychology around consumption doesn't matter. It's almost certainly healthier, and many societies do this. They basically have one-ish meal a day. They'll have little light snacks or whatever, but they have one big meal a day. Great. Maybe that's better for you. If you're like, I don't have time, fine. Just don't eat, right? Just, lots of people do this. It's perfectly human possible. But this notion that somehow you're doing great things for yourself, very, very, very suspicious. If you haven't noticed, I'm very suspicious of this idea, because it suggests that you're too busy to spend time with people having a pleasant meal. Even though, again, what's good for you? What do you value? What is it that you're achieving in that time that would be better than that? Maybe something like, okay, if you are in an emergency room and there's been a horrible accident and you're an ER doctor or nurse or technician or something, and you're working 20 hours saving lives, 100% you slam that shake right there with you. But don't do that all the time, because you'll just kill yourself and then you can't help anybody. But most of us, come on, let's be serious here. How many of us are really have our time so optimally committed to hugely important tasks that we can't take a little time for ourselves and or to spend time with other people? And again, this circles right back around to the tiny house movement, because it's like, oh, if I make this small, if I make it inexpensive, of course, they always say how cheap these are per meal. And if I can just do it for me, then that will make life better. And of course, you can see that if everybody pursues this strategy, where you end up with is a bunch of isolated, lonely people in tiny houses drinking these horrible shakes. And that would be a really sort of dystopic world. Now, I don't think we're going there, by the way. It's just that it's so curious to me that you see these concepts promoted consistently in the media. You see it's all over the place and it's successfully promoted because it so accurately fills these sort of generally unstated values that we all swim in all the time. And so when you think about ethics and you think about your values, this is where I think both these examples, particularly that tiny house one, which I think is more neutral. Like I get both sides of it. The shake meal thing, obviously, I'm sort of just totally dubious on that one. But you go, oh, right. So even these sorts of things start to articulate like, oh, why would I do that? Why would I just take a shake and slam it rather than sit down with friends? And I go, oh, I don't have any friends around who I can sit down with. Like, oh, now we're at a more core. Are friends a core value? Maybe they're not. Maybe you're like, you know what? I hate all people. I don't want to ever see anybody. I don't want to talk to them. I have no time for anybody. Leave me alone. It's like, great. You're missing the hello Schopenhauer, right? That's sort of great. Maybe he would have a same. No, he was actually slightly more convivial than one might have thought. But right, if you're this real misanthropic person, that's great. Be a misanthrope. Good for you. But most people, no. So as you face challenges and questions like where to live, how do I want to live, who do I want to live with, take a moment and pause and go, hey, my culture really emphasizes individualism, and that's not wrong. But it's like, is it serving me? Is this what level of individualism would make me healthy? What level of individualism would bring most joy, or whatever it is, vigor, intellectual challenge, whatever you value, whatever it is your core values are, to your life? And then when you've answered that question, then you can go, oh, maybe I don't want a tiny house. I want a big house, and I want to fill it with a lot of people. So we all have the same amount of space, but it's shared and I get to be around people. Or you might say, no, I want to be on my own, but I want to have a lot of big space. So I'm going to have a big ass house and I'm going to wander around in it all by myself, right? So there you go. Sure, why not? But at least ask so that those values are not simply being expressed unconsciously, that we're making decisions that seem like they're meaningful when in fact they're really just parroting the training that we've received. So yeah, the ethics of tiny houses, ethics part 4. Thank you very much.